Hey everyone, this is FIDE Master Kostya here for Chess.com, and today I'll be doing part 2 of the new series, the Sinquefield Cup highlights, showing you guys some of the best played games and most interesting positions from the recently concluded Sinquefield Cup. Today's game is Levon Aronian playing white against Hikaru Nakamura playing black, and this was round 4 in the event. So at this point, Hikaru Nakamura was actually half a point ahead of Magnus Carlsen, who eventually won the tournament. And he's playing his favorite King's Indian defense with black. Definitely the opening has become a bit less like a King's Indian and more like a Benoni with the pawn structure c5, d6, and e7. But still, it's in the family of dark square openings, not too far from the King's Indian that has scored Hikaru so many nice victories here. So black has just played this move a5, and the point of this move is to expand a bit on the queen side and to potentially play bishop a6 in some lines, trying to trade off the light squared bishops. And here Aronian played a4. Really nice move, just taking control over this b5 square, so that if black does ever play bishop a6, white can play bishop b5, stick his bishop on that square, and black will probably not want to trade bishops because white will play a takes b5 and get this passed pawn on b5, which will be pretty good. Essentially, white, in a lot of these lines, can try to set up a small bind on the light squares and try to make black's life quite miserable here. Here, with the black pawn still on e7 and white's bishop on c4, black is really no position to play e6. White will just take it and win some material. So because of this, I think black's position is a little bit passive, and white definitely stands better here. Usually black has the open e-file and can generate counterplay against the c4 pawn, but here with the pawn on e7, I think white is doing very well in the center in terms of space and control. So Nakamura played knight b6, bishop d3 was played, and knight e8. So with this move, bishop d3, Aronian is actually trying to induce black to play c4. But this would definitely be a mistake, because after bishop c2, white gets this d4 square for their pieces, and they can play knight d4 and knight c6, and that knight is going to be a very unwelcome guest on that c6 square. So instead, Nakamura played knight e8. His idea was to bring his knight over to the queen side and to support the control of some squares like a6 and b5. And this also opens up black's dark squared bishop. I'm not so sure about this plan because, as we'll see in the game, black's king side ended up being slightly weak, and they definitely could have used the presence of the knight there. But hindsight is 20/20, so it's easy for us to say now that this knight e8 move might have been slightly dubious, but during the game it certainly looked like a logical idea. So Aronian played rook e1. He's simply trying to complete his development and keep control over the position. Knight c7, rook c1, simply supporting this knight and getting ready to play b3, which would restrict black's options on the queen side. Knight a6 was played, b3, knight b4, and bishop b1. So white has pretty much achieved their ideal setup. They've got all their pieces developed, and I really like what Aronian has done with this position, because there's no obvious way for black to really make progress here. The move c4 will always give up the d4 square, and white could probably immediately just play knight d4 and put that knight on c6. So this really isn't a good idea for black. But other than that, it's really not clear what to do. Nakamura ended up playing bishop b7, and this move is basically prophylactic. He's trying to prevent white from breaking through with e5 by putting as much pressure as he can on the d5 pawn. But as we'll see in the game, Aronian was not really interested in playing e5 just yet. And without the move e5, the bishop on b7 does look quite passive. Pretty much biting on granite here, with the pawn d5 being supported by the pawn e4. So Aronian played knight e2. And I really like this move. He transfers the knight over to the king side, and he's ready to launch a pretty decisive attack against black's king. Nakamura played rook c8. He's got to try to create some kind of counterplay with c4. And here Aronian played h4. Really a nice idea. He's ready to play h5 and open up black's king side. So Nakamura played c4, and Aronian played h5 himself. If black had played h5, I think this would have been quite weakening. And after queen d2, white is threatening bishop h6, trading off the dark-squared bishops, and I think black's king would be quite weak here. White can also think about playing knight f4 or knight g3 and potentially sacrificing on h5, breaking through with e5, opening up that bishop on b1. And you guys can analyze this at home with your computers and your engines, and you'll see that white is getting a pretty strong attack in all these lines. So h5 would have been quite risky. Instead, Nakamura chose to play c4, trying to expand on the queen side and open some lines there. Aronian played h5, and here Nakamura played c takes b3, and Lev simply recaptured queen takes b3. And here black is in huge trouble. They would have really rather have their pawn be on h7 to protect the g6 pawn. But here with the pawn on h6, white's pawn on h5 is really annoying. The problem is that white is starting to capture on g6, and if black recaptures, they'll play knight f4 or knight d4, and the g6 and e6 squares will be incredibly weak. And if black takes his pawn on h5, then simply knight g3. The knight is coming to f5 or h5, and they'll be attacking this poor bishop on g7, and the h6 pawn is pretty loose, and white is just going to have a really strong attack there. So Nakamura played g5, trying to avoid these lines, controlling the f4 square. But the drawback of this move is that it just gives up the f5 square, which becomes a huge target for white's pieces. Aronian played knight g3, and as we can see, this knight is coming into f5, and black's position is looking really, really bad. I mean, after knight f5, he's going to be threatening the bishop, and if this bishop falls, all the dark squares around black's king will be weak. For instance, black could try bishop a6, but then we'll play knight f5, and if this bishop moves and the h6 pawn falls, so let's say knight d7, and simply bishop d4, and black's dark squares are really suffering here. Once these bishops get traded, the h6 pawn will be hard to defend. White can always break through with e5, and it just looks really, really bad for black here. So as we can see, Aronian's setup with all his pieces in the center turned out to be really successful, and this attack h4, h5 proved to be decisive. In the game, Nakamura decided to play knight takes d5, sacrificing a piece, trying to complicate the position, change the dynamics. Practically speaking, this was probably a good idea because otherwise white's attack was just going to be winning and crushing, but objectively speaking, after white simply takes the knight and bishop takes d5, white does have a piece for 2 pawns, and with objectively good play, white should win the game here. Aronian chose rook takes c8, and Nakamura decided to trade queens by bishop takes b3. If he played queen takes c8, then after something like queen d1, I think white's piece is definitely stronger than black's 2 pawns here. The problem for black is that white still has a nice initiative on the king side. They're still threatening knight f5 and bishop d4 and things like that. And, black's 2 pawns are on e7 and d6, not really doing a whole lot other than just sitting there like weak targets. So instead of keeping queens on the board, Nakamura decided to play bishop takes b3, rook takes d8, and rook takes d8. And his idea was that he's likely going to win this a4 pawn, and with all the pawns on the same side of the board, maybe he can try and defend against white's extra piece. But as I mentioned before, white still has the initiative on the king side, and Aronian played quite actively with this move knight f5 to realize his advantage. Nakamura have to play bishop f8, bishop b6, rook b8. He played bishop c7, rook c8, took this pawn on a5, knight c6, bishop c3, bishop takes a4, and bishop a2. And although Nakamura got what he kind of wanted, he traded the 8 pawns and left all the pawns on one side of the board. This position was technically winning for white. All he had to do was trade some pieces, bring his knight from h2 to g4, putting pressure on this h6 pawn, and Nakamura was simply unable to hold the position. So by winning this game, Aronian actually gave himself chances to fight for the first place. Nakamura dropped down to second, and after Carlsen's second win over Kamsky, he jumped into first place with 2 rounds to go, and ended up winning the tournament. Next time I'll be showing you guys more highlights from the Sinquefield Cup, so definitely stick around and make sure to be on the lookout for those videos. Thanks a lot for listening, and I'll see you around on Chess.com.